Ben, welcome back. You spoke at the event in 2019, which feels like a decade ago.
15 years ago. Thanks for having me.
But actually not that long ago. So you are the co-founder and chief analytics officer of Mode, which is a collaborative platform for data analysts and data scientists.
Yeah, correct. So one of the founders of Mode, we started it just over 9 years ago. So it's now been a while. It is a BI tool, basically, but a BI tool built for people who don't like BI. So it's like
conflicted people.
Yeah, exactly. That are like analysts that have to provide BI but don't really want to do it. And so I do a few different things there. My title is technically Chief Analytics Officer. It's a made-up title because when you start a company, you can make up a title.
In fact, that's why you started a company.
Yeah, exactly. It's all for the LinkedIn. So my job there is kind of twofold. It's a lot of basically talking to folks in the community, trying to figure out where the space is going, where Mode wants to be, and then a lot of product work, kind of funneling that back into the things we build, the way we talk about it, what we can do to provide things for our customers, stuff like that.
Okay, very cool. And one major thing that has changed since we spoke in 2019, at least I believe, is that you started a blog or Substack, which I personally love, and I don't say that about everyone. I think Benn's writing is super brilliant and provocative and interesting. So I'll do the plug so you don't have to do it. So it's Benn, BENN, .substack.com. And you write very prolifically every week. So it's actually a great place to start for a lot of people who are in technical roles or product roles in technical companies. There's been this rise of people writing interesting content, but professional content. So why do you write?
So when we first started Mode, it was three of us. Our CEO, who was presentable and could talk to investors and customers, the guy who was our technical co-founder, who was our CTO, who was actually building the product, and me, who was neither of those things and had no real job. And so back then, what I did was I wrote a blog, and it was a blog that we had no product and nothing to sort of advertise. So it was basically a blog about data adjacent things that was it was like pre-538, but it was kind of 538-ish stuff. Like the very first blog on Mode's corporate blog is a post I did like 3 days after we started the company that was about Miley Cyrus and the VMAs. And so I did that for 6 months because I had no other job. And it actually worked reasonably well as this got some data people interested in what Mode was. They had no idea what the product was, but it was these people are talking about stuff that seems sort of interesting, even if it's not terribly relevant to what I do day to day. Over the course of my time at Mode, you bounce around a bunch of different jobs. You did stuff in support and product and marketing and solutions and all these different things. At some point, basically, everybody at Mode realized I'm not good at any of those jobs, and I slowly got myself fired from all of them. And so wound my way back to doing a blog. This was about 18 months ago I started doing it with the intent of it kind of being back to that original, just write about data-related things. It kind of took on a life of its own of I'll figure out stuff that's interesting. That evolved a lot into what's going on in the data world because a lot of things have changed from what it was in 2013 to now. And so it kind of ended up just falling into this habit of, all right, do it once a week, talk about kind of commentary on the data world, I guess. It doesn't really have much of an editorial direction, but it's I don't know. At this point, I kind of do it for my entertainment and just trying to kind of stay on top of what's going on and, I don't know, think out loud in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and for anyone that's in startups and thinking about content marketing and technical writing and all those things, do you, beyond your own entertainment, do you try to trace this back to any kind of metrics or lead generation or any of those things? I mean, I can certainly vouch for the fact that everybody in the data world reads this thing, so it's usually influential. But do you have metrics attached to it?
Much to our marketing team's chagrin, we do not. So we have Substack doesn't do a great job of helping you out here. We have metrics of I follow how many people subscribe to it, and you can look at traffic to it, and it goes up on Fridays and goes down on Saturdays. In terms of tying it back to driving leads at Mode, not really. And in a lot of ways, that's not the goal. I started doing it as let's see what happens. Now there is some push from, as would make sense, from folks in the marketing team and stuff to be all right, what do we you need to actually deliver some value here. And so like a lot of though I think is to me the value of it is it's not marketing content. It's not going to be like at the end of it. And by the way, Mode solves this problem. Buy Mode. I don't want it to be that. That doesn't mean there aren't ways to turn it into something that's useful or turn sort of the brand into something useful or whatever. But that's a little bit of a work in progress. Like to us, it was, and to me, it was like, all right, write it, do it for something that's interesting and fun and kind of see what happens. And then if it works, figure it out from there. If it doesn't work, I guess I'll yell at my quarter on the internet and know to pay attention.
Okay, great. So there's so many gems in that, but I'd love to dig into some of them. One that I personally think a lot about is the sort of the 10,000 foot view, market overview, if you want, of the modern data stack, which
you think
called
about the 10th. You really? You?
Yeah. Then I pontificate endlessly. It's a living. And you called it both a powder keg and a Ponzi scheme, and I'd love to go into that. And maybe to make this super interesting and relevant for everyone, just start with a quick definition of what actually the modern data stack means, which is not always what people think it is.
So my definition of the modern data stack to me is it's data companies that launched on Product Hunt. It's like an imprecise definition, but to me, like the question, so modern data stack generally I think is like modern data tools, kind of has modern architecture, it's cloud-based, it's meant for analytics teams and not sort of traditional BI developer teams. How exactly you draw lines around that, people can debate. My view of it is it's basically products that are meant to sell in kind of a bottoms-up motion. The Product Hunt thing kind of works because, one, it ties to the timing. That's roughly when things started. Like when Product Hunt became a thing is roughly when all these tools started coming out, the early ones like Looker and FiveTran and all those sorts of things. It's also, one of the questions I have when people ask, like, what's the modern data stack is, Oracle released a new cloud data warehouse. Is that a part of the modern data stack? And if it's like, no, it's going to, why not? But you're just hating on Oracle.
It's not cool.
Yeah, like it's just not cool enough, I guess. I suspect that wasn't on Product Hunt. I don't know if Product Hunt's cool anymore or not either. But anyway, that sort of fits the brand to me. So I think it's like all of the tools in that space that are, a lot of things are for data practitioners. A lot of them are for like data adjacent people. A lot of them are like data tools that are being brought to marketers, to product people, to engineers. But basically anything you can put on your diagram to me roughly fits into that category.
So why is it a Ponzi scheme then?
It's a lot of companies.
Just for you, this is not a crypto conference, but we do talk about Ponzi schemes as well.
Actual Ponzi schemes. So the problem to me is there's too many companies basically selling to too small of problems that it's still expensive to build a data company. We don't yet have kind of the iPhone appification yet of data products, where you can build an iPhone app with a couple people. It's pretty cheap to build. If it takes off, great. You can turn it into something bigger. But like Instagram was 50 people, when it was worth $1 billion. WhatsApp was like 10, and everybody became billionaires. All these companies could get really big because the platform is there to support being able to build a very rich application without a whole lot of investment. And so you can have thousands and thousands of apps because the market can support them, and the market can support ones that don't make a whole lot of money. The data world still is like, it's pretty expensive to build a data product. Like you got to go out, you got to go raise venture money. If you're raising venture money, you're going to expect to have a pretty big return, and you're going to expect to have make a bunch of money. All those companies are chasing, in their pitch decks, here's our path to $100 million. Market's big, it ain't that big. And what ends up happening, I think, is a lot of these companies are chasing these fairly narrow wedges that feel big in the moment when everybody's excited about it, but like pretty quickly they're going to realize they're all stepping on each other's toes, and that fallout has to go somewhere. Like, not all of these companies can be the next Figma that they all now say that they are, and so it's what happens then. And I think it's somewhat of a reckoning has to come. There may be some like softer landings and stuff for folks and ways out, but it seems very difficult for these companies. The slide you create does not have $1,000 billion companies on it. It's just like that's $1 trillion market, and like, no. It's popular, it's not that popular.
And you were saying in the last a couple of years in particular of a frothy VC environment. There was a little bit of data people in companies that actually knew what they were talking about, left their companies to start a company, and because all the data people left, the companies had to buy the product that those people left built.
Yeah, so there was to me like this all kind of peaked in this like there was a conference in Austin. It's called Data Council. Good conference, pro that conference. Like no striking against that conference. The timing of it was just like too perfect. Where it was the first big in-person data conference among kind of the modern data stack community. It was this big like celebration of the modern data stack. Astronomer acquired a company in the middle of it. It was also like right as the market was teetering. And there was this kind of moment of like, I don't know, like dancing on the deck of the Titanic a little bit of like, wait a minute, are we going to have this party next year? Because I don't know if we're going to have this party next year. But anyway, in response to that conference, a couple of people were saying basically like, there were a lot of data practitioners there who had become founders, and they viewed it as these people kind of are inevitably going to be successful because when data practitioners start companies, they create more of a market for more data people to sell to, and there are fewer data people to be able to build data products internally, so we have to go buy them, and it's like, how can this all fail? And it felt a little bit like how housing price is going to go down in 2007. And so, yeah, it doesn't seem like it's going to really hold up. Like, I think there will be a lot of money made, a lot of really good companies built, but it's in the very explosive, expansive phase to me where there's a lot of people chasing very narrow wedges that when push comes to shove, they're going to have to be like, oh, we actually need to be a much bigger product to be able to make a path to $100 million.
Yeah. And in your various blog posts, you go with a lot of vigor and enthusiasm after some of the industry's sacred cows. So like one by one, and maybe starting with Snowflake, which is like the company everybody loves, and that's actually the most highly valued software company in the world in terms of multiple. And you wrote very interestingly, which I think is a fantastic thought exercise. You wrote a blog post about the scenarios where Snowflake would actually fail. Just walk us through the thesis.
Yeah. So I'm bullish on Snowflake. I don't think Snowflake's going to fail. They seem to be smart. They seem to be doing well. But it is them, along with a few other folks, have become kind of this default where we assume, okay, Snowflake is going to take over. Like Larry Ellison's going to be dead. We're all going to use Snowflake. Oracle's gone. It's going to be the next $1 trillion thing. And like to me, the interesting question there is, okay, let's assume it's not. Let's just like assume in 5 years something has gone horribly wrong because there is a path to somewhere. So there's some timeline on which that is where we end up. How might we get there? Like, what does that actually look like? And the kind of current set of thinking around Snowflake is, well, it's expensive. That data tools are extremely indiscriminate in the amount of load that they put on Snowflake. One of the nice things about Astronomer is anybody can run queries on Snowflake. You know who really loves that? Snowflake. You know who doesn't love it? The people who pay the bills for Snowflake. And at some point, that becomes kind of problematic. But I don't think that, to me, that doesn't really represent a real threat because that's basically like Snowflake died because it was too popular. It's like, well, okay, they'll probably figure that one out. I think the more interesting question for Snowflake is, at their conference in the summer, they released a ton of new features. It's no longer a database. It's like this whole platform that is... It's an app, like a layer for building apps. It's a bunch of like other data management tools. They want to build more things on top of it. It can be a transactional database potentially. There's a question to me whether or not those bells and whistles stick. And if they don't, what I feel like you end up with is an extremely complicated and overpriced database that you just want something that has like horsepower. So I remember a couple years ago, this was like 8 years ago, pandemic. I was trying to buy a TV, and I just wanted a TV that played videos. And you go into Best Buy, and they have a bunch of these like smart TVs. And it's like, oh, this one can turn on your dishwasher. And I'm like, doesn't make sense, but okay. And so I ended up finding a TV that was just a TV. And to me, it's like the question is, does the market want a database that can turn on your dishwasher, that is all of these other things, that is this giant data platform that will cost a lot, but is okay because it has all these features, or does it want just something that is performant and is a TV? And there's a lot of new technology of like things like DuckDB and stuff like that, that if you just want a TV, that might be better. And then you can run that TV on kind of like bare metal AWS. You can run it for way less price than you're probably paying for Snowflake. So I think that's the real question to me is if Snowflake can make all of these things one single package where you can't buy the TV without the other pieces, like that is, the database is all of these things now. I think they're in a really good spot. If they can't, and it feels like I'm adding a bunch of add-ons I don't actually want, then I think they still probably will be fine, but you run the risk of getting really undercut by someone who just says, like, I will sell this thing to you at cost, basically, that can probably perform more or less the same way.
Yeah, and even if they want to be all those things, they're going to be competing for like different features with different people, like the Firebolt for interactive queries and Databricks and a bunch of others.
Yeah, and there's another version of this that goes even sort of in the more extreme direction of maybe we don't want just a TV, maybe we want to just buy a house in a box, where if Google figured it out, like Google to me is one of those companies that's sort of like, what are you doing? They have a ton of technology to be able to solve all these problems in a really like buy an entire data stack in one fell swoop. They haven't pieced it together yet, but I think like that's another place where something like Snowflake comes a little bit under risk if we start to buy data products the same way we buy like cloud infrastructure, where if you're using GCP, chances are you're just going to use GCP for everything. Like you may be multi-cloud, but you're not going to buy one GCP service over here and one AWS service over here and Azure over here. You're going to buy them all to work together. I could see the data world moving in that direction because there's so much, like the ecosystem is so big. Fine, AWS has a drop down of 300 services. Chances are I'll just choose the one from them. Then Snowflake is trying to compete with like the packaging of Microsoft, of AWS, of Google, and that's like a little bit of a tougher compete too. But I think like that's probably not the direction it goes.
Okay, so that's Snowflake. Let's talk about FiveTran and ETL, and maybe just in 1 minute, what is FiveTran and what is ETL? We had George Fraser, the CEO, at this event online during the pandemic, but maybe as a refresher.
So FiveTran is like the far left of this diagram y'all just saw. It is, you got a bunch of data in third-party sources or in data warehouses. You want to centralize it into your central warehouse, be it Snowflake or Databricks or BigQuery or whatever. The way you had to do that before, the first data team I worked on in Silicon Valley did this. You had to basically write a bunch of stuff to scrape things out of APIs of these services. So you'd have to basically hire an engineer to scrape stuff out of Salesforce's API. It was an enormous pain. The API is actually decent, but it's still like you have to manage it. When things change, you have to fix it. FiveTran does it all for you. So FiveTran is basically like pull data out of various services. They connect to a couple hundred now. I don't know how many. You push a button, you say sync the data from this service into your warehouse, and they just do all of it for you. So it's essentially like a copy it from thing that doesn't quite look like a database into a database, and then you can build all the stuff you just saw on top of it.
And it's a company that's been around for like about 10 years and is actually, as far as I know, one of those like companies over 100 million in revenue. So what's the case against, not necessarily them, but like that space?
So to me, the potential question there is, it's like a little bit of an awkward thing for a company to be sitting as this middleman, where what they essentially do is they sit in between, take Salesforce and Snowflake, they sit in between those two. They have to maintain a connection to Salesforce's APIs. When Salesforce changes it, which Salesforce doesn't care what FiveTran does. Like, I mean, FiveTran's maybe big enough now that they do a little bit, but like third-party services aren't going to go call FiveTran and be like, hey, we're changing our API, fix it. So FiveTran basically has to maintain that. The way they also get data out of it is they scrape it. Some companies provide ways for like, we are making changes, they push it to other services, but a lot of times it's just like run a script against the API, check the differences, and like put the thing back into the database and batch. That's kind of a clunky way to do this. Like, it would be sort of more sensible if you could design this in a perfect world that Salesforce just writes it to a database. Now, obviously, they didn't do that way back when because nobody wanted it, but now it's become such a thing to say, hey, we want our data out of your SaaS software into a database, not for the sake of migrating away from Salesforce, but for the sake of all the analytics that we're going to do on top of it. Salesforce could just provide that directly and say, okay, we'll connect to Snowflake. They actually just kind of released a partnership that's dancing in this direction a little bit. But services, SaaS services could do this, where they just write essentially directly to databases, and they basically take the cut that FiveTran's paying. So instead of me as a data team saying, oh, I'm going to go buy FiveTran to do this, I'm going to pay them $10K a year to sync data from A to B. I'll pay $8K to the SaaS service to do it. They'll probably do a better job because they're maintaining the SaaS service already. They know when it changes. They can push rather than pull. And so it's like a little bit of a better setup. It just like kind of makes more sense.
Have you seen people starting to do that?
There are some companies that have done this before. Companies like Segment, basically event tracking services did this because that's kind of the product. Stripe has a way to do this. There's a few that kind of have some crude versions of this. I actually talked to George like a little bit after that post. His take is, which I think is probably fair, is it's a lot harder to build that than you think. That like the reason FiveTran is a $6 billion company or whatever is because they did a bunch of awful work that none of us want to do. And so as a SaaS business, like Mode could do this. Mode could build a thing that syncs stuff to Snowflake. We're not going to because we have other things to build. And like, sure, we could monetize it, but it's not really worth it. We're not looking for something that like marginally makes us more money. We need to make things that are going to make us 10x more money. So I think that's the reason we don't. The one thing to me that changes that dynamic is if Snowflake or Databricks or whoever start to say, hey, we want to make it really easy for people to be able to do this. And we build services that make it so that we can like in a week build that connection to Snowflake. So they have kind of an app layer essentially, but instead of it being something built on top of Snowflake, it's more of like an ingestion app layer where we can just write to that thing and Snowflake sort of handles all the complexity. And it's like, okay, we would do that. And then we would go off and sell it and stick it in an enterprise tier because you're always chasing features to put in an enterprise tier. So I think that's like how you kind of get there. But, you know, it doesn't undercut everything for FiveTran, but it potentially undercuts the big sources, which I imagine are the things that are like the real drivers of revenue for them.
All right, and the upcoming one is DBT, and we had Tristan, the CEO of DBT, just a couple of events ago, and just again like to rephrase like all of this, like all of this is done with love and just as a way to think through where our industry is going, as opposed to like criticizing anyone in particular. But can you, the post on DBT has not come out. Can you give us like a little bit of a preview?
What's the preview of the DBT one? That it's fundamentally wrong, basically, that like DBT is a transformation tool. They're moving in like the semantic layer tool. So basically they're saying, give us raw data and we will tell you, like apply semantics to it. The way that they do that now is through SQL. So like semantics are kind of like air quote semantics. It's basically like semantics as messy data to a clean data set. It's not really semantics. It's not really connected together in a real way. Like it's not a model. The analogy I've used for this before is DBT is basically because you create a bunch of tables. The model is essentially like an animated movie where each shot is independent of the other one. Like, yeah, they're connected in like a DAG, but they're not really logically connected. If you want to build a real model, you probably want something from like Pixar, or if you want to shoot a different shot, you actually can just say like, point it from that direction, and you know it's going to be the same thing. Whereas in DBT's case, if you sort of point it from the other direction, you got to make a new model, and that model could be different. Like you could draw, Aladdin with a hat on differently or whatever. To me, as they move in this like semantic direction, move towards things like metrics, move towards things like sort of real-time computation, it may be that the SQL approach, like define it all in queries and tables, doesn't work anymore. Where you're starting to be like, oh, we actually need ways to define joins. We need ways to define these relationships. And you start to edge towards like, oh, DBT is a bunch of tables with LookML built on top. But it's going to be a weird LookML. And then it's like, I think you potentially get yourself in trouble there because the fundamental like framework that DBT doesn't quite make sense anymore. And so then you're rebuilding semantic models that people have been building for 20 years on top of a sort of weird footing, and you're also way behind. And so I think like that's DBT is I think really popular because it's so easy to get up and running, but it may also eventually be like, if it had an undoing, to me that would be the undoing, is the thing that was really easy to get up and running doesn't actually solve the real problem that we need to solve down the road.
You just mentioned DAGs in passing, and you had some like really funny analogies with how airports work. Do you want to maybe remind people what a DAG is and why it may or may not make sense in the data world?
Yeah. Okay. So a DAG. I mean, the astronomer folks can define this much better than I can. I'll attempt to do them justice. It's basically a series of steps where you go like A to B to C, where you're going in one direction, and it's dominoes where one knocks over the next one. And it can be like there's like very complicated domino things where like one domino somehow knocks over 50, and then there's 50 funnel into one, and they come back to each other and they draw a picture of Tupac's face. But like you have all of these essentially tasks that line up and sort of are sequential to one another in some way. To me, like, okay, that makes sense. But if you're thinking about orchestrating stuff, the thing I care about as a consumer of this, like I'm a pointy-haired executive in some ways now, is I want a thing delivered at a certain time. Like I care about when the end product arrives to me. I don't actually care about when I knock over the first domino. That all is like, you tell me, you figure that out. Like the demo was, okay, we need to have this model set up so that an executive gets a thing at 5 a.m. when they wake up in the morning and they're checking their phone before they do whatever. The thing I care about is that 5 a.m. thing, not the various steps that have to happen before. But the way we've built DAGs are kind of like, when do I start the thing? Like, when do I kick over the first one? And then we line it up such that we hope the thing arrives at the end. And the way it would make more sense to me is you just tell the thing, I need this thing to be here by 5 a.m. You figure out what has to happen beforehand, and then like kick over the dominoes when they need to be kicked over. And so the airport analogy to me is the way you would actually schedule flights in an airport is you decide when the flight's going to happen, and then the airport's going to be like, okay, we got to take this flight off from New York to San Francisco. Okay, we're going to have certain people to be ready for it, to be doing the bagging for it, to be like loading the plane, all those sorts of things. And eventually that backs into, well, when are people going to arrive at the airport? When is the train going to get here? All that kind of stuff. What you shouldn't do is be like, all right, we're going to have a bunch of taxis arrive at the airport. When a certain number of taxis arrive, then we'll check people in the gate. And then once they're there, we'll put them in the plane. And the plane will take off whenever that finishes. And it's like, that doesn't really make sense. But that's kind of how we structure these processes. It's not quite, but to me, it would like make a lot more sense if the system could just be define the end product you want in kind of a declarative way. And then if you understand what needs to be orchestrated to do it, okay, you just go do it. Like I don't want to know your process. I just want to know my thing is going to be there when I need it to be there.
All right, maybe one last one from your many gems. Let's talk about data products and the data mesh. And we had, we had Jamak at this event as well. So we had all those people and who, are fantastically smart and interesting folks. But I'm curious about your take, and same deal. If you could just describe what it is first, and then go into the thesis.
Nobody has any idea. I cannot describe either of those things because they have no definition. Okay, data products. Data products are like a few things, maybe. There are data products are sometimes considered data apps. When people say data apps, they usually mean like a blinged out dashboard. It's like a dashboard with some widgets. A data product, I guess, is like a data app that can write back to the database and like is interactive in some way. All right, I guess that's kind of fair. My view, and the example I've used before on like a data product is, I think Yelp is actually the best example of a data product. I don't know how I define that, but it's a product that solves a problem that is not a data problem, but fundamentally you can't remove data from it. That ultimately what Yelp is like serving me a bunch of data. That's all it really is it's like a bunch of tables, but presented in a way that allows me to use it to solve exactly the problem I want, which is like, where do I eat tonight? Yelp could be a dashboard. Like it could be a BI tool with some widgets. But like be a kind of, as like a data person, it'd be kind of fun to play around with and stuff. But like generally it'd be a pretty terrible experience to be like log into Yelp and you get a Looker dashboard. Like no knock on Looker, but I don't know what I'd do with that. So to me, like data products are more of what is the product experience? Like from what problem are we solving? Okay, how is data incorporated into that? If we can make data kind of a fundamental part of that, then that's more of a data product. So it's kind of a vague thing. And I think that's where, like if we think about what does the modern data stack go, I think it's serving products like that, where, okay, we are, another example I think I've used before is Figma, worth a bunch of money now. if I'm a designer in Figma, one thing that I might want to be able to see is, as I'm like designing screens of an existing UI, how much do people actually use those things? Like, what are the experiences that people are actually touching in that UI? You could potentially incorporate data into that such that the data sort of surface to people in the moment they need it in the product that you're trying to use to solve the problem, instead of going to a dashboard and like clicking on some stuff. So I think that's like where ultimately all of this like could go, is that kind of integrated experience. I have no idea how we get there, but okay. Data mesh. It's a schemas. The way people describe the data mesh is decentralized data ownership. So it is, rather than having like data be sort of centralized into a single team and that team distributed out to everybody else, it's individual teams own their component parts of it in kind of alignment with the way that the centralized team would sort of say these are best practices. And then that way the people who own the data, like as it is produced, also own the output of it and things like that. So it's less like funnel it through a middleman. It's more of, okay, you are the marketing team. This is your component of the data mesh that you own. And so like there is more decentralized ownership. Okay, I guess. Seems hard to manage in practice. The way I've seen people describe it is basically it's the thing that you naturally create when you're a very big organization and you can't have a centralized data team that can possibly centralize everything, which is fair but kind of uninteresting, I guess. But I don't know. This is one of those that I've like, the only way I can understand it is something that seems simpler than it should be, and once it gets more complicated, I am no longer smart enough to understand it.
What's a bull case for this whole space, and like reasons to be excited about the next few years? You know, trends or what have you?
I think it's to me it is things like these data products, basically, where if that is the way that everything gets done and the expectation is that is the way everything gets done, then what the data landscape becomes is a second version of cloud infrastructure, essentially, where if we are building products on top of, if data is the core thing that we need to build products on top of, you start to have to build an entire collection of services and stuff around it to support that. I don't know if it's as big as like web hosting stuff, but it becomes something where, like Snowflake's ambition to me. Snowflake's ambition is, as best I can sort of parse it, not just to be a database, but to be this platform on which you can build things. And so if I could like run an entire company on top of Snowflake. If you can do that, then you start to say, okay, like there's a bunch of technology underneath this that being able to do this enables, like being able to build a product on top of Snowflake enables me to do, where I can build all of these like integrated services into my product. Again, kind of the Figma example, or ways that people do marketing now, a lot of automated marketing tooling. All that stuff can be rebuilt on top of like a data infrastructure instead of on top of just sort of AWS and S3 and EC2 and all that kind of stuff. So I think like the thing that the ecosystem gets really big is that there becomes sort of an entire developers on top of it that isn't just people building kind of like tools for data companies, but are people building products that are fundamentally like inseparable from the modern data stack or whatever that kind of collection of things is. That's how you get really big. Beyond that, it's more like data teams become popular, and so everybody just needs a bunch of data products. And that seems like the median outcome is the data philosophies of Facebook and LinkedIn and all these kind of early tech companies gets adopted by the enterprise. And so all of these sort of modern data tools that tech companies buy today go off and get sold to Coca-Cola and Caterpillar and all that kind of stuff. And that market's big. It's not, that big. It's not big enough to support 1,000 unicorns, but it's big.
And is there a path or a world where, what seems to be like this constant reinvention of tools to solve the same problem, does that stop? Like I'm referring to, there was like the whole wave for like Hadoop, and then, cloud vendors. At some point, like everybody was saying, well, cloud is going to like solve it all, and then that evolved to like Snowflake plus Kubernetes, and that sort of evolved into the modern data stack. I'm like, does it ever stop, or like every 5 years we're just going to collectively reinvent the whole thing?
Probably not. I mean, there's money.
It's good for my business.
Yeah, VC. Speaking of Ponzi schemes, no, and I think a lot of it is because there's like a pendulum that swings back and forth on this stuff, where there's this whole, is Airflow being unbundled or rebundled or bundled in a different way, kind of conversation 6 months ago. That type of conversation of like unbundling tools and then rebundling them, I think we'll go back and forth on that forever. Where take the Snowflake piece. Snowflake becomes a database. Okay, then they become this data platform. We all love all the features, but then, Firebolt comes along and says, no, we're just the super fast database. We're like, oh, a database without all the features. Great, that's way better. And then Firebolt becomes popular. And then we're like, wait, but maybe if we tack on all these features, that'll be really great too. And so I think like there is that kind of pendulum that I think will kind of happen inevitably, where there will always be some, we've specialized too much. Let's make a generalized tool. We have a generalized tool. Let's specialize. Does that represent like real steps forward? I don't know. Probably in some ways, but yeah, I think there's like will always be enough. Sort of the space has gotten big enough now that I think we have like a somewhat of a perpetual motion machine of reinvention at this point.
Great. I want to open up for questions in a minute, but maybe sort of to close. Let's actually talk about mode. We haven't. What does Mode do today? What's the roadmap? What are you excited about?
Yeah, so Mode is it's a BI and analytics product, sits on top of your warehouse, has like a SQL IDE, has a visualization tool similar to something like you get in Tableau, has some embedded notebooks. The idea behind it is basically data teams have to provide reporting to businesses. Like that is a core part of their function. They have traditionally not liked the way they've had to do it. They don't want to work like LookML, and Looker is great, but a lot of analysts aren't like wanting to write LookML all day. They want to use tools that are sort of more native to them. But you still have to provide the dashboarding sort of experience. And so our view is, how do we get it so that, how do we build a tool that can solve the BI and self-serve reporting problem while also doing it in a way that is more comfortable for analysts and is comfortable for their end users as well. And so for us, it's about bringing those experiences together. Like we don't see it as reinventing notebooks or reinventing visualizations. It's more of what are the best experiences that we can provide to people in those different sort of form factors, and then give them all in one kind of seamless way. So what does that mean for the roadmap is largely about how do we think about bringing those tools together and bringing the people who are working on them together in better ways. The other place where we see kind of pushing the roadmap is, our view is the data stack is basically turned on its side, where it used to be BI tools would be governance, they would be visualization, they would sometimes be storage. Those things have since been separated out, where storage is its own layer, governance and transformation are its own layer, and we see like consumption is its own layer. So instead of building a BI tool that is integrated with its own kind of like data modeling layer, we see it as how do we integrate with sort of the data modeling layers people want to use, like dbt, if they're wanting to use some of the newer stuff like Transform, for instance, that they've pivoted to some degree. But the other tools that are like ways to do semantics in the database, rather than that living in your BI tool, we think that should live in a more generalized layer, and then we just consume from it.
Okay, very good. All right, as promised, I want to open to questions if there are some. All right, I'll Tony raise his hand first. You'll be next.
Anyway, interesting talk. I don't know where to start, but I'm just going to seize on one point that you were making, which you were talking about, like how problems have gotten so fragmented. There were so a lot. That's a point problem. So you're giving like DBT and FiveTran examples. What I'm wondering is the end state that you're looking for kind of like a declarative approach where you say, like, kind of like in Star Trek, hey, data pipeline, I want to have this information by 8 o'clock so I can answer this question at that point. Question I have here, it's two halves of the question. One, has the landscape, the industry landscape, the vendor landscape, technology landscape gotten too fragmented to make that happen? And the second half of the question is the answer to that, solution to that being more vertical integration. In other words, Snowflake, acquires upstream, Databricks, acquires upstream, et cetera, et cetera.
So yes, it probably has gotten too fragmented for that to be like well done today. That's the challenge I would pose to folks at Astronomer of how do you solve this problem. The one way is potentially to like it get verticalized again, so Snowflake starts a database. Okay, now they start building up the stack and say, great, we can integrate with all these things because we just provide those services. This also to me is the more likely model is something like the way that cloud providers work, where they are separate products that can technically work across different products, but you largely just buy them from one service because they're kind of neatly coupled. So if I can integrate a bunch of AWS services together really easily, but they're separate products, kind of. Outside of that, I don't actually know how it's a very difficult thing to get a bunch of these tools to sort of talk the same language. I think there are ways to get there. I don't think the way we get there is sort of like through open standards and stuff like that. I don't think anybody will actually adhere to that. I think most likely what happens is Snowflake basically says, hey, if you do things in this particular way, we can integrate with you. And then a bunch of people are like, well, there's a lot of gravity around Snowflake. We'll build into that piece. Okay, that becomes kind of the dominant standard. dbt is actually doing a little bit of this already. They don't quite have like the APIs into it the way you might want. But a lot of people are sort of like starting to circle around dbt standards as a way to think about this stuff. There's a lot of like gingerification now of things that are happening in the data world because dbt has made that kind of a concept people understand. So I could see that happening where we find some sort of pole that we all gravitate around, but it's still kind of too fragmented for that to be that realistic at this point.
This is kind of a similar question. Going to Data Council, I saw like that as kind of a smaller event than something like an RSA in security and potentially a larger market. So like maybe 3 to 5 years out, do you see less players in the data space? And is that driven by consolidation, going to some of those cloud providers, or just because you think the space is overvalued and maybe Matt can't sleep tonight because he's got a lot of capital deployed?
Probably are less companies in the space. Like I think it's less that there's like less companies. It's more that today in a place like Data Council, which again I have nothing bad to say about the conference. There's a lot of startups in roughly the same phase. There's a lot of startups between like Series A to Series C that have raised somewhere between $10 and $100 million. Which is like an A round in 2019 or 2020. I don't think we have that, where there's a bunch of companies that are all kind of chasing very big outcomes where there aren't clear winners yet. I think there will be more, this is the winner in this particular part of the ecosystem. There's a lot of smaller players trying to figure out like where do they fit in. But now it feels like everybody is still chasing the very big outcome. Another way to kind of put this is, we're still in a phase where it feels like the platforms haven't yet been defined, where everybody wants to be the Apple like App Store. Not many of us are going to actually be. And at some point, we just got to chase building the apps that are going to make not enormous amounts of money, but will make enough to make a sustainable business. I think because nothing is settled yet, a lot of people are chasing like, can I be the canonical platform in this space? And so you have much bigger ambitions there than everybody can achieve. Doesn't mean some people won't. But everybody wants to be like the standard for their particular piece of the industry because it's still kind of a free-for-all to be able to do that. And I don't think that is still the case. I don't think it's like the standard. Right now, the only standards are like there's a handful of databases. dbt somehow still operates in a space that has essentially no competition, which I don't know how they pulled that off. But outside of that, there's not really, I mean, even like BI, which is a pretty established corner of the market, there's not a standard. There's not like the thing that everybody goes out and buys. And so I think there will be more of that by that point. And so it's more of figuring out the corners to operate in instead of who's going to be the standard observability tool, the standard ETL tool, the standard, are those things even things that need standards? I think that'll be more settled.
All right, cool. One last one.
Hi. Because of the lack of standards that you mentioned, do you think that there is a scope for proprietary databases, like something that's domain specific in the startup world that one could actually just cater if you have the human resource and the brain power to write proprietary databases rather than relying on something like Snowflake or anything that's out there? Have you come across any such proprietary databases in your world?
Snowflake is a proprietary database, but proprietary in the sense that
meaning like something that domain specific. If I want to start up,
So like a database for
just for
climate
my own business
stuff. I don't know. I'm making this up. Yeah. I mean, I would think that there would be. This I guess gets actually a little bit to your question, which is where like that's probably what happens is at some point you stop chasing. Can we be the next cloud data warehouse? I mean, everybody will always be chasing that a little bit. There will always be someone who's like going to disrupt Snowflake in the same way Oracle didn't win forever and Microsoft didn't win forever. But that becomes a much harder sell, and probably what you end up chasing is like, where are the places where Snowflake really struggles? Graph databases. Maybe Snowflake really struggles in places where that's useful, or for particular verticals, as you said. Maybe there's stuff in like finance. I don't know, like crypto might have special databases type of thing. I have no idea how crypto works, but maybe there's particular things there that work really well. So I could see that, but that is a little bit of the moon's orbiting the planet rather than everybody trying to be the planet.
Great. Well, that feels like a wonderful place to leave it. Thank you so much. This was terrific. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming back, and I hope you'll come back again.